You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a new podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, data-driven look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And today's conversation will focus on the labor market. What is the state of the U.S. labor market, and how can employers attract and retain workers while offsetting increasing wages? Joining me today is Dr. Gad Levanon, who is our head of the Labor Markets Institute at the Conference Board. Gad, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Pleasure to be here.
So, Gad, every newspaper I pick up, every show on television, radio, talking about labor markets, and you're a labor market economist. This must be, like watching sports for you. But what is the current situation in the U.S. for labor demand?
Well, we are now still at the reopening part of the economy, the recovery from the pandemic. So, in general, there's a very strong job growth. Delta is disrupting this a little, probably already in August and September as well. But after that, I expect strong job growth to continue as those in-service industries open up again.
Yeah, so this Delta variant, and now there's the Mu variant, MU, which is yet another letter. But these variants are spooking people, and you're starting to see just sort of employers kind of backing off a little on hiring.
Yeah, and because people are spending less on those in-person services, so you need fewer workers. I think especially there are two groups that I would say are more kind of cautious, the older people where the virus is more dangerous for, and also families with young children under 12 that are not vaccinated yet. So those groups are probably more cautious, and until COVID is almost entirely gone, we're probably going to see less spending from those groups.
Yeah, and you have over 5 million people still out of the labor force from comparison to pre-COVID times, and the majority of them are women who are dealing with family issues and so forth. So, this Delta variant now is spooking schools, and you wouldn't think about what happens in the schools as affecting the labor market, but it does.
Yeah, I think both schools and people who are in general afraid to get infected, they, especially in jobs that have a lot of interaction with other people, I think that certainly keeps some people from going back to the labor market.
Yeah, and so it's a difficult time, especially for women who tend to be the caregivers, both elder care and child care. But you talk about stress levels. When they're trying to deal with doing their job remotely, but at the same time taking care of their family at home, making sure that the kids attend school via computer. I mean, this has been a difficult time.
Yeah, and I can attest from my own wife. There's more gray hair there.
Yeah, you're talking about yourself. Your gray hair, I know. Your poor wife. Yes. But there's a huge impact. So, what do you think it's going to take for the labor market to normalize?
I think it will take some time, but also there are other factors that are probably going to make the normalization come faster. One is the expiration of the enhanced unemployment benefit. So in many types of jobs, especially low-paying jobs, you could get more staying at home than going to work. And so that's definitely been a factor. And now that those I think are expiring as we speak, in the next several months we'll see more people going back to the labor market. I think, having sustained open schools is going to also help. And, there may be disruptions, but in many school districts they said that if you're vaccinated, you will still continue to go to school, and schools will not shut down. So I think that will be another factor. But, as long as the COVID is around, I think some people will be cautious about going back.
But don't you, I think, the experts, the virologists, which are neither of us, are saying that we as a society need to learn to live with COVID, meaning it's going to be with us for a long time. But I think, that means that we're going to need high levels of vaccination and to get to some level of normalization, like we were with the flu and the cold season, right? Yeah. So, any predictions? Is that going to be? Are we there, or is it going to be next spring or next fall?
Well, in the U.S., we are certainly not there yet. Yeah. I think as we speak, we are seeing a peak in the number of new infections. So for it to come back to a much lower level where I think everything could be normal, it's probably not 2021. I would say it's beyond that.
It's beyond that, yeah. Okay, so, the other thing that is interesting is something called the labor participation rate, and you've written extensively about this. And it's interesting that out of a population of, what are we now, 335 million or something like that in the United States, there's only, 62% of the people that work. Now, some of that's because people are retired and some people are too young to work, but it's a surprisingly small number.
Yeah, we were, a few decades ago, we were ahead of most advanced economies, but in labor force participation. But now we are, I think, at the bottom half of the group in that regard. Yeah, and in the pandemic knocked it down, and we are slow to recover, especially the group that saw the biggest drop are the 65 plus. There was a significant, after almost 30 years of continuous increase in the labor force participation of older Americans, since the pandemic, we are 2 percentage points down and no recovery in sight.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any numbers on this, but I keep hearing stories about people who are in their early 60s going into the pandemic, and now we're, a year and a half or 2 years, going to be 2 years into it, and they're saying, well, I don't want to go back to the office. I'll just retire. I mean, are you seeing numbers like that?
I think this pandemic, or I would say pandemic recession, is very different in terms of the participation of older workers compared to, let's say, the Great Recession, for two reasons. One is this pandemic is especially dangerous for older people. But second, in terms of financial preparedness, if you remember, in the Great Recession, people delayed retirement because they were not financially prepared. Their 401ks were down, home prices were down. Now it's the exact opposite. Stock markets are extremely high. Home prices are high, so people are more financially prepared to retire, so they are not that desperate to stay in the labor force.
Yeah, until they're not. These things go in cycles. We've both seen this. So where is all this excess supply? So you mentioned the older group, but there's also some supply in the younger groups too.
One of the most important trends, both culturally and in terms of its impact on the labor market, is especially young men without a BA. If you look at a group of 25 to 34 young men without a BA, they are much more likely to live with their parents, and they are much less likely to participate in the labor force. So we are certainly seeing, and there was a drop in that group in the pandemic. So it's not just the older people, and as you mentioned earlier, mothers, that's also, they were lower the labor force participation. Hopefully the opening of the schools will change that, but there are pockets of low participation.
So, a lot of our listeners might say, well, what's the big deal about that? But, as an economist, it is a big deal, because in order to grow our GDP and grow the size of our economy and produce wealth in the economy, we need to be able to expand the amount of output, which requires labor in a market like ours. Talk a little bit about how the United States structurally is different from, say, other countries, and why the labor market's even more critical here.
Yeah, you do need labor to grow. I think that's true in every country. For example, the labor shortages that we are experiencing now, which is a lot of it because of a lower supply of labor, it's not just raising wages and creating recruiting difficulties, it actually prevents companies from returning to full operation. I was just in a restaurant the other day, and I was told you have to wait 40 minutes. And I asked, but your restaurant is half empty. Why do I need to wait? And they said, we just don't have enough staff to serve everyone. So it's like companies are losing money, losing revenue because they don't have enough workers.
And we're hearing this from the conference board members too. Production lines are being shut down because they don't have enough people to run the production lines. Our favorite subject, truck drivers, which is the number one job classification in America. I don't know if most people know that, but there are not enough truck drivers, so that you've got loads sitting, waiting to be moved.
Yeah, the labor shortage is especially visible in low-paying jobs and blue-collar manual services. A lot of it is because of the enhanced unemployment benefits. They are most impactful on people who who have a low wage because it covers more of their wage. So we see especially very tight and very strong labor shortages in those jobs.
So let's talk about wages, because wages are going up. If you think back a year and a half ago, we were talking about, we need to raise the minimum wage, and isn't it terrible, and it needs to go to 15. Now you see Walmart and all these others who were paying, $7 minimum wage before, blowing right past the $15 an hour wage. I mean, their wages have doubled. And, this is all, basic economics, right? It's 101. Demand, when a demand is greater than supply, the price goes up.
Yeah.
So how does all this work, and where does this stop?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, so first of all, it may not entirely stop because, at the beginning, I would say a few months ago, we had major labor shortages and the unemployment rate was still high. In a year or two, we will have very low unemployment rate. So we may have this problem in the long run. But I would say this labor shortages that we are at now is somewhat temporary because of those supply factors that are, the enhanced unemployment benefits. I think in the next several months, we may see some easing in the labor shortage and wage growth will not go through the roof as it's going now.
Well, help us understand, this whole relationship between inflation, which we're seeing go crazy in the marketplace, and wages. Because if I'm running a company, and my wages are going up, I've got to raise prices.
Yeah.
Now, as I raise prices, then everybody else gets hit with this, and then in order to pay for increased cost of goods that consumers are buying, they need the wages to go up. So does this just create a vicious circle?
So there is this thing that's called the wage price spiral. That was a big deal, I would say 30, 40 years ago. It was a major part of the economics teaching and the economy. And in recent decades, it kind of evaporated a little, this phrase, because we had very low inflation for several decades. Now we have very high inflation. I would say at the beginning it was not because of wages, it was because of other factors like shortages in chips and shipping costs and things like that, and rental cars. That pushed inflation up. And we may see for the first time, inflation, for the first time in several decades, inflation being a factor in wage determination, and wage being a major factor in price determination.
And they kind of feed each other, which is why you say you don't think it's temporary.
Well, I think that is a risk. I don't know how likely it is to happen, but I think wage price spiral is on the table for the first time in several decades.
In a long time, yeah. We're talking with Dr. Gad Levanon, the head of the Labor Markets Institute at the Conference Board, and we've talked about the state of the labor market and what we can expect going forward. Next, we'll do a deeper dive into what companies can do to counteract these wage increases. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with our conversation.
Hi, I'm Eric Schwartzman, author of The Digital Pivot: Secrets of Online Marketing, the first non-technical book for the general business reader that simplifies the process of digital marketing. If you're in marketing, public relations, corporate communications, or promotions, The Digital Pivot explains in simple, jargon-free language exactly what it takes to build an audience and convert sales online. And it also explains your department's role in the digital business landscape. So if you want a digital marketing MBA in a single book with plenty of interesting stories From my 20-year career in digital marketing consulting with Boeing, Toyota, and the U.S. Department of Defense, go to digitalpivotbook.com and order a copy. You can also get an audiobook read by me. And if you're looking for a dynamic speaker to keynote your next event or talk to your group about pivoting to digital marketing, check out my 2021 speaker reel at ericschwartzman.com.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by the head of our Labor Markets Institute at the Conference Board, Dr. Gad Levanon. Okay, Gad, so we've got this wage price cycle kicking back in after all these decades. What should companies be doing to offset wage increases?
Well, I think there are several things. One is in order to create a situation when you need fewer workers by automating and having more efficient processes. The decade before the pandemic was not good in that regard. We had the lowest labor productivity growth in the U.S.
What does that mean? What is labor productivity?
Labor productivity is how much you get down per hour of work. That's
right.
In a
so
simple.
So it's how efficient,
yeah,
and how much work you're getting out of a labor hour, essentially.
Yeah. And if you're more skilled, you're more productive. If you have better equipment and machinery, you're more productive. And if you have a good CEO who coordinates everything in a more efficient way, you also are more productive.
Well, and if people work longer hours, for the same for a salary, for instance, the hours don't matter then.
Yeah, exactly. So, and in the last decade, we had the lowest labor productivity growth in U.S. history. And part of it was because automation was very weak in many areas, especially manufacturing. Kind of the low-hanging fruit of replacing workers with technology already took place decades ago, and it was harder to increase labor productivity further.
But part of that is because there was labor arbitrage. I mean, we moved a lot of the heavy labor overseas to where there was really cheap labor, places like China and India and Southeast Asia. And so we were getting the benefit. It was cheaper to ship it all the way across the ocean and make it over there. Yeah. And so you essentially had this rebalancing of labor around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And you've written on this too. Yeah. But that seems to have now hit some level of equilibrium, and it may be even moving backwards.
Yeah, definitely in manufacturing, there is much less offshoring than there used to be. There may be more offshoring in services, like a lot of IT companies and consulting companies. They are shifting jobs to other places, but definitely in manufacturing and in general, you have much less offshoring now than you used to.
Well, and then we're not going to get into all of the the international conflicts and so forth, but I think people are concerned about security of their nations and trying to do that, so that constrains it as well. But okay, so automation is a big factor here. So companies can try to automate, but you can't automate a truck driver.
Well, I'm
quoting Dr. Gad Levanon on that.
I think that not in the next decade, probably not in the next 2 decades, even though, that there's a company, I won't name names, that every year they say 7 years from now.
7 years,
so
exactly.
It's, I think it's much harder than it is in theory. But I think there is a limit to how much you can automate. I do think that kind of the massive labor shortage that we are at and kind of the shift to online, that may provide some new opportunities for automation, but I wouldn't expect it to be like a game changer.
Well, so what else can we do? Okay, so you can automate, and by automation, you're talking about obviously things in automate warehouses, you can automate stores, and your point is move to selling on the internet, so you don't need bricks and mortar, and that's more efficient. Yeah, but you do still have that last mile.
Yeah, and that, So I think the majority of jobs we won't be able to automate much anytime soon. One area that I think the pandemic did make changes in banking. A lot of transactions that people used to come to the branch to do, they had to learn how to do it online, like deposit a check. And so now this is one of the areas where we don't see a full recovery in employment. The number of jobs is likely to remain lower.
Yeah, but the service industries are tough. I mean, they're talking. So you're seeing in restaurants, people are using iPads to order. They're not, you don't have people that you're sending around, so you're cutting down the labor, but you still have to somehow cook the food. Even in the back of the house, as they say it in the restaurant industry, even if you bring it in so that it's mostly cooked and you're just doing less, heating and prepping, there's still a lot of labor required to do this.
Yeah, there is. I think that's a very and even like you order online, or in the iPad, but someone has to bring you the food. So it's there is still a lot of labor there.
Yeah, and you still can't get your hair cut over the internet. I'm trying to figure out that business model. So basically, what you're saying is try to automate, try to get more efficient, try to balance it, try to do with less locations, so that you're dealing. For instance, if you're distributing goods, try to deal with it direct to consumer, and then you're taking advantage of an infrastructure that's in place for that last mile. So,
I think another thing is, before the pandemic, we also had a labor shortage, and what we saw there, that demographic groups that were less attached to the labor market increased their labor force participation significantly. And the best example are Hispanic women. They saw their labor force participation increase dramatically. And I think that's another kind of tapping into groups demographic groups that you typically do not use. That is another thing that will happen when we see labor shortages.
These labor participation numbers are the official numbers, but there is an underground economy, a cash economy that is happening. How significant is that?
I think it varies a lot by industry, but I'm sure that in certain industries like construction and food services, that's a pretty significant part still.
Yeah. And so and then we can always import labor.
Immigration, yeah.
Yeah, open the southern border. Oh wait, we did that. No, there is look, when you have a natural 1% population growth rate, which is what the developed world has and this country has, you need to add immigrants. So that's another.
Yeah, that's not a solution for the current labor shortage because it will take time to kind of change the immigration rules. But I definitely think that in the next decade, businesses will scream as hard as they can because the labor shortage is going to be real, and hopefully things in Washington will move.
Now, right now, there's about 5 million people, little over 5 million people who don't have jobs or haven't come back in. But at the same time, there's I don't know, what is it now, 6 or 8 million job openings, and maybe more. So there's an imbalance here. And people say, well, some of it's just the jobs are where the people aren't, so there's a geographic imbalance, but there's also skill set imbalances.
Yeah, there is. I think the biggest imbalance is simply that a lot of people who a few years ago were in the labor force were not, at least until now, were not interested in working. And I think that's where there is still a lot of potential of just using the people who until 2-3 years ago worked to bring them back.
So if you were running a services company today, where would you go? I mean, would you be trying to train people? Would you just be trying to pay more? Would you be trying to import labor? What strategies would you be using?
I think there isn't one strategy that fixes everything, but I think there are a few things that companies can do beyond the things that we talked about, like raising wages and automating. And I think a lot in the recruitment process could change in a period of labor shortage. So, for example, adding or modifying employee referral programs, contracting with staffing firms. Another thing that, especially in kind of the lower paid jobs, is having a much faster recruiting process, because in many times, if you take your time in interviewing and making a decision, the person will have 3 other offers. So having like shorter interview periods, making quick decisions, that could be crucial in a time like this. Also, I think a lot of job descriptions are still stuck in periods where labor was very abundant. do you really need all those requirements that you ask for? Do you need a BA, or maybe this job can be done without a BA? Do you need 7-year experience, or 4 years may be enough? So I think that's another thing I'm kind of reevaluating the requirements.
Well, in remote work, I mean, people have been, they've moved in the last year and a half, and they don't want to move back to the big cities and go, pack themselves in offices for, 18 hours a day. Yeah. That whole world has changed. So I think, employers need to be more flexible.
Yeah, and I think that would be fascinating to see which companies stick to the office model and which are becoming more hybrid, and how will employees react, whether they will, be willing to move to another company for more flexible work arrangement. We just had a survey that was done by our human capital team that suggests that it is a big factor that a lot of people are considering moving to another company to get more flexible work arrangements.
Yeah, you quoted a number. What percentage of people in that survey?
I think 1/3, if I remember.
1/3 of respondents
are considering leaving their company within the next 6 months.
So if you're an employer, you don't know whether that 1/3 applies, to every employer. But if you're an employer and you knew that 1/3 of the respondents in a survey, I mean, that means that you've got to do something different with your current population. That may be the closest and the most immediate need.
And I think the first step is to gather information, try to survey your employees, get a sense of how many are this is a factor for them, and try to target those workers.
There's one more thing. Having been CEO of a couple of large companies, I didn't realize this at the time, but that we use software to screen applicants, to screen resumes essentially, and a lot of resumes and applicants are kicked out automatically, without anybody making a decision based on bad coding. You screen them out. Also, if people have a gap on their resume, it kicks them out automatically. So the long-term unemployed are sort of stuck in no man's land, because you, by definition, you get kicked out.
Yeah, you don't get a chance to interview even.
Yeah. And so we've got to look at all of these screening processes too.
Exactly.
Yeah. Gad, thanks for joining us today and providing our listeners with a roundup of insights on the state and the trajectory of the U.S. labor market and the challenges and opportunities to business.
Thank you, Steve, for having me.
Dr. Gad Levanon, the head of the Labor Markets Institute at the Conference Board. And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO's Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a leader from our centers or other business executives to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover leading topics in public policy, environmental, social, and governance, marketing and communications, the economy, the human capital area, and more. Please share the CEO Perspectives podcast with your colleagues and friends. I'm sure that they'd love to hear it. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.